What the wind whispered in the cathedrals, foundations beneath the stone. Close your eyes, Now imagine a place not made to be entered, but to be felt. A place where silence is not emptiness, but a presence. Where every stone was laid with a prayer, every arch curved with awe, and every shadow held a secret older than the world you know. This is not a story about architecture. It's a story about memory carved in stone. A story about cathedrals. They rise like mountains made by hands. But beneath them, before the bells, before the glass, before the flying buttresses and vaulted ceilings, there was soil, earth, mud, and a whispered reason to begin. No cathedral was born from a blueprint. They were born from longing. A longing to touch something higher. To build something that could withstand time, and perhaps, even death. Let us go back to the beginning. To the 11th century. Europe was not yet a continent of kings, but of hunger, of plague, of silence, and of faith so vast it needed to be built. In small monastic communities, the vision came first. A dream, a calling, sometimes from scripture, sometimes from a vision in the night. And so, beneath a sky not yet scarred by smoke, a stake was driven into the earth. This is where it will rise. There were no machines, no modern cranes. Only muscle, stone, rope, and patience. Hundreds of men, many who would never see the final spire, began to dig. First trenches, then pits, then the foundations. But even here, in the ground, they carved symbolic corners, planted blessed relics, hid tiny bones of saints, buried coins for the poor, as if to tell the earth, this place is not just a building. It is a body, it will breathe. The first stone was sacred. It was laid not by the strongest man, but often by a priest, a monk, or even a child. They would bless it with water and ash, press their hand to its surface, and speak words that would never echo again. Let this be the heart of God's house. And so began the cathedral's slow birth. Day by day, stone by stone, a body began to rise from the earth. Imagine standing in that field, no towers yet, no glass. Just outlines in the dirt, chalk markings. And men kneeling, not in prayer, but to lift. The stonemasons, the true sculptors of time, knew something no one else did, that every line must be perfect. Because imperfection in a wall could become collapse in a generation. Their tools were primitive, but their minds were calibrated like stars, each stone measured, each curve rehearsed in wooden models. They weren't just building upwards, they were building meaning. Many didn't speak the same language. Germans, Italians, Bretons, Franks. But they shared the language of stone. They spoke through hammers. They communicated in chalk lines. And when they prayed, they didn't ask for riches. They asked to finish, to not fall, to leave their mark, even if no one would ever know their name. Below the structure, tunnels were carved. Hidden chambers. Crypts, not just for the dead, but for the secret keepers. Some rooms were meant only for monks. Some never to be opened again. Others waited for the bones of saints or for relics smuggled from far-off lands. The foundation of a cathedral was always more than stone. It was belief, buried. And the wind was always there. Crept through scaffolds. It kissed the sweat of the masons. It howled between walls yet to be closed. And sometimes they said, you could hear it speak. Build it tall, but build it true. Children grew old as the walls rose. Mothers passed before the altar was laid. And men died before the bell was ever cast. But none of them stopped. Because what they were building was never just for them. It was for the sky. For the soul. For something they didn't need to name, only trust. And so the cathedral continued to rise. Not fast, not proud, but patient. As if it already knew that someday, someone like you would ask, what did it mean to build something that would outlive you? And the wind would answer. The walls that heard everything. They rose slowly, not like trees, but like memory taking shape. The walls of a cathedral were not simply built. They were summoned through sweat, silence, and sacrifice. Every block lifted was a heartbeat. Every stone placed was a vow. Not to a king, not to a bishop, but to time itself, because these walls were meant to last far beyond the hands that raised them, and they would listen. Imagine, now stepping inside one. The roof is not yet sealed. The sunlight pours through openings like liquid gold. And in the silence, you hear it, the stories being whispered into the walls. The masons who worked the inner sanctum spoke little as they carved, not just out of discipline, but out of reverence. Some believed that speech could disturb the balance of stone. Others simply had nothing left to say. Their hands were covered in chalk, their backs in sweat, their minds in mathematics and myth. And when they did speak, it was in murmurs. Too wide here. Chisel softer. Leave room for the angel's foot. They weren't building for the present. They were building for a voice they'd never hear. Each wall had its guardians, columns shaped like saints, grotesques with open mouths to swallow sin, patterns that repeated not by chance, but by cosmic alignment. It was said that if you stood in the right place, beneath the right arch, at the right time of day, the wall would sing back, not in words, but in resonance, a harmony hidden in limestone. Inside those walls were layers, not just of plaster or paint, but of intention. Some areas were left hollow, not for weight, but for sound to travel. Echoes were studied, voices tested. Priests would walk barefoot across the nave, speaking Latin aloud, judging which spaces lifted the voice to the heavens, and which swallowed it whole. A cathedral was not silent. It was a living instrument, and the walls were its strings. On some of those walls, messages were left, not in ink, but in carvings. Tiny inscriptions by hands long gone. Forgive me. My child is buried beneath. I am afraid. I believe. These weren't graffiti. They were prayers that needed stone to survive. And they're still there. Worn, shallow, hidden behind layers of centuries. But they exist. The walls remember them. Then came the colors. Before glass, before pigments, there were ashes and blood. Paint was made from minerals, crushed beetles, and sacred oils. Every mural was a sermon. Every color a symbol. Blue, the divine. Red, the sacrifice. Gold, the eternal light. But colors faded, rain leaked. Dust gathered. And so new layers were added. Not to erase the old, but to build upon it. Every painting was a palimpsest of belief. You could never see it all at once. But if you looked long enough, you felt it. The depth, the devotion. The voices inside the brush. Some parts of the walls were never meant to be seen. Behind the altars. Above the ceiling vaults. Within the hollow ribs of flying buttresses. In those spaces, monks sometimes hid messages, scriptures, relics, even warnings. One scroll found centuries later, read only. The stones are listening. And perhaps they were. Pilgrims would press their hands to the walls, hoping to absorb the holiness. Mothers whispered names into cracks, begging for healing. Children dared each other to touch the statues and see if the saints would blink. The walls heard it all. Laughter, grief, confession, silence. They held weddings, funerals, coronations, betrayals, and they never crumbled, only listened. In time, dust gathered in the corners. Cobwebs danced in the beams. The voices changed. Latin became French. French became silence again, but the walls never forgot, because that's what cathedrals were, stone memory. Not of facts, but of feelings. Not of names, but of weight. The weight of being human in the presence of something vast, and in the wind that still swirls through broken stained glass in open cloisters, a sound remains, a murmur, a listening, a breath. As if the cathedral is still awake. Still waiting, still remembering, still whispering. The ceilings that touched the sky, They were never just roofs. To the people who entered these places for the first time, the ceilings of cathedrals didn't cover the sacred, they revealed it. Looking up wasn't just an act of awe. It was an act of surrender, of wonder, of remembering where you came from and where you were going. Because to look up in a cathedral was to stare into the sky made by hands. The first ceilings were flat, wooden, dark. Built for function, not flight. But slowly, as ambition whispered into blueprints, and the desire to imitate the heavens grew louder, stone began to rise, and arches were born. Gothic architecture did something no one thought possible. It made stone float. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, they weren't just innovations. They were revelations. Because suddenly, ceilings could soar. And not just physically, but symbolically. They could lift prayers, lift spirits, lift the very idea of being human into something divine. Imagine standing there, your feet still on the cold, cracked stone, but your eyes are lost in patterns so intricate. They resemble snowflakes made of stars. The ribs of the ceiling reach out in perfect tension, each point balanced, each curve purposeful. To some, it looked like the petals of a great flower. To others, the hands of angels stretched wide. To others still, a map of the universe. They were painted. Once. Bright blues, deep golds, crimsons. Some ceilings had stars, not random dots, but carefully aligned with constellations. As above, so below. Others had scenes, saints, demons, heavenly choirs. But over time, the paint faded. Dust dimmed the colors. Candles smoked the surfaces. Restorations covered over history. Still, if you look closely, there are flecks, hints, traces of what once gleamed. And in that faded beauty, something else lives, time itself. But the ceilings weren't only built to be seen. They were built to sing. Yes, sing. Because the shape of a cathedral's vault amplifies sound, softens it, extends it. So when a choir sang beneath it, the notes didn't stop, they lingered. They rose. They stayed, and for a moment, the ceiling became a mirror of music, a heaven not seen, but heard. This is why many believe that cathedrals were instruments, and the ceiling, its hollow bones and curves, was the resonating chamber, a single. Words spoken in the right tone could be heard in every corner. Not loudly, but clearly. As if the building itself had ears, and maybe it did. The architects who designed these ceilings were mathematicians, mystics, visionaries. They didn't draw lines. They plotted meaning. Some ceilings aligned with the solstice. Some were built with sacred ratios, the golden mean, the Fibonacci spiral. They weren't just creating shelter. They were drawing the invisible. They believed that divine harmony could be built into geometry, that the structure itself could teach the soul how to listen. There's a story of one ceiling in a forgotten chapel where a mason carved a single phrase hidden among the ribs. I will never touch the sky, but I will shape it. And that's what they did. They shaped the sky with stone, with faith, with silence. Even now, when tourists walk beneath those ceilings, talking, photographing, rushing, the vaults don't collapse. They don't complain. They simply hold. And wait, because ceilings remember more than what's beneath them. They remember what was hoped for above them. And when the wind whispers through broken panes and brushes across the ribs of ancient vaults, it doesn't ask questions. It simply hums. A soft, constant tone, the kind you can feel in your chest if you stand still long enough. The sound of something vast being held by something human. The glass that told stories without words, before books were read, before words were known, before stories had letters. There was light, not just the light of the sun, but light shaped by color. Light that passed through ancient fire, cooled into sand, and became windows that spoke without voices. This is the story of stained glass, the breath of the cathedral. The light that remembers. To the illiterate, The cathedral's walls were silence. But the windows, they were scripture in color, a sermon for the eyes. A gospel of images that they told of saints and serpents, of angels and exiles, of sacrifice and redemption, not in language, but in light that moved across stone floors like a divine shadow play. Imagine entering the nave at dawn. The rising sun pours through a rose window. Not white light, but blood red, sea blue, sunflower-yellow. It hits the dust in the air, turning it into gold. It dances across your cloak, your hands, your face. Suddenly, you are inside the story, bathed in it, touched by it. Not as a reader, but as a character. The craftsmen who made these windows were not just artists. They were alchemists of light. Glass was sacred, rare, expensive, and dangerous to work with. Each pane was hand-blown, shaped with tools centuries old, dyed with minerals and fire, cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold dust for red. It was said that the red glass, the deepest crimson, required real blood. But perhaps that was only a myth, or perhaps some truths are too sacred to confirm. Each window began with a story, a scene chosen by the bishop, or the abbot, or sometimes a patron who had lost a child and wanted their face forever in the light. Then came the design. Cartoons, they were called, full-scale drawings. Then the glass was cut, painted, fired, and joined with lead. Each window could take months, sometimes years. And when finally installed, when sunlight first touched, if it lived, they were not only beautiful, they were didactic, educational, powerful. The poor would stand in the cold, watching the crucifixion unfold in ruby and gold. The rich would trace the birth of saints through the circular rows, from petal to petal. And children would look for animals, lions, doves, dragons, because even beasts had a place in the cathedral's light. At night, the windows went dark, but in the memory of the walls, the images remained. Like dreams, the cathedral held until dawn came again. And when the bells rang at matins, and the monks began to chant, the first glimmer of sunrise would filter through the eastern apse, and the story would begin again. Not all glass survived. Wars came, kings fell, windows shattered. Some were replaced, some left blank, some reimagined. But in the fragments, historians found fingerprints, tiny specks of paint, a forgotten saint's halo, a tear in Mary's eye. Even in broken glass, the story whispered on, because stories, the real ones, do not need to be whole to be true. In the great cathedrals of France, England, Germany, light still falls across old stones. Tourists pass through quickly, they take photos. But if they were silent and stayed just a moment longer, they might hear the whisper, "Look not with your eyes, look with your longing." Because that's how the first pilgrims saw, not with knowledge, but with hunger, with reverence, with awe. The windows were more than decoration. They were invitations to rise above the ground, to remember what color feels like on the soul, to be held by light, without needing to hold back. And when wind passes through a broken pane, as it often does, it sometimes carries with it a single beam of golden light. And for just a second, the story lives again, without words, without names, just color, and wonder. The altars, where silence was a language. Not everything in the cathedral was meant to rise. Some things were meant to fall, to the knees, to the soul, to the hush that arrives when the human heart finally realizes it is not alone. This is the story of the altar, not a table, not a stage, not a symbol, but a threshold between the seen and the unseen, between the finite and the eternal. Altars were always at the center. Even if not in position, then in purpose. The building rose around them. Vaults, windows, columns, they all pointed toward this one space, the sacred table. But not everyone could approach it. Only the priests, the pure, the chosen. To step behind the altar rail was to step out of the world and into something invisible. It was carved from stone, or hewn from wood, or wrapped in cloth. Sometimes plain, sometimes radiant with gold leaf and relics, but always, the altar was more than what it appeared, because it held weight, not the weight of objects, but of presence. The kind of presence that made people weep without understanding why. Before a word was spoken, there was silence. Silence before the prayer. Silence before the sacrament. Silence before the miracle. It wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It was a language only altars could teach. Conversation between the human and the holy that needed no sound, no logic, only surrender. At the altar, bread became body, wine became blood. Time folded in on itself. Priest would lift the chalice, whisper words older than any kingdom, and the room would change, not visibly, not audibly, but something would shift. The air would grow still. Even the birds outside would pause their song, because the altar had spoken. Not everyone believed. Some doubted, some feared. Some stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes unmoved. Even they, if they were honest, would admit to feeling something. Like standing at the edge of a great ocean at night. You see nothing, but you know it's there. And it knows you. There were hidden altars, too. In chapels beneath the cathedral, in crypts, in cloisters. Places where monks knelt for hours in the cold with nothing but candlelight and breath. They didn't speak. They listened. To the stone, to the silence, to the ache within them that only the sacred could hold. Pilgrims would travel for days, sometimes barefoot, to place a single coin on the altar's edge. A gesture, a prayer, a bargain. Take this, and please, heal her. Take this, and please, bring him home. Sometimes the coin was stolen. Sometimes it stayed for decades. But the prayer always stayed, because altars keep what is offered. During wars, altars were desecrated, looted, burned. But somehow they endured. A wooden beam, half buried in ash, was once found still marked with wax from a candle that had burned centuries ago. And beneath it, a tiny carving. I saw him here. No date, no name, only a moment that became eternal. And still today, when you enter a cathedral, if you walk slowly toward the front, if you breathe with intention, if you pause before the altar. You might feel it. The hush, the pull, the memory. And the silence that greets you. It is not absence. It is recognition. The aisles where time walked slowly. To walk a cathedral's aisle is to walk between worlds, not just from the entrance to the altar, but from the noise of the world into the quiet pulse of eternity. Aisles are more than pathways. They are rivers of memory, lined with stone, echo, and intention. Every foot that stepped upon them left something behind, and the stone remembers. Most never notice them. They hurried toward the pews, the altars, the light, but the aisles held something deeper, something slower, more intimate. They were where people lingered. Where hearts cracked open in silence. Where the soles of shoes carried centuries of dust into sacred procession. The central aisle, the nave, was the spine of the cathedral, straight, strong, leading directly to the sacred. But the side aisles, narrow, dimly lit, shadowed by columns, were different. Here, the world felt slower. Monks walked them at dawn. Priests whispered prayers beneath their breath. Widows held candles for sons long buried. And lovers, yes, lovers, slipped notes into cracks between stones. Because even here, love needed to be remembered. Time walked differently in these spaces. You could stand still, and yet feel as though you drifted into another century. Sounds were muffled. Your own footsteps became strangers, and the wind, always the wind, would creep in through unseen windows, grazing your skin like a memory you forgot was yours. Some aisles were marked with tombs, flat stones beneath your feet, etched with names long worn away. Knights, priests, Children. And as you walked on death, but also on devotion, because to be buried beneath the aisle was a final pilgrimage. A resting place on the road to light. Candles lined these aisles. Soft flames, dancing in rhythm with breath. People would stop to light. One, not for the light it gave, but for the hope it symbolized. One flame for healing. Another for forgiveness. Another for a name they couldn't say aloud. And the flame would burn long after they'd gone, like a voice still speaking without sound. Pilgrims traced the walls with their hands, not just to steady themselves, but to feel what others had felt. Smooth stone in some places, worn and rough in others. In one cathedral, a patch of wall was hollowed out by thousands of fingertips touching the same spot over hundreds of years. They said that if you pressed your palm there, you could hear a heartbeat. Maybe theirs, maybe your own, maybe the buildings. The aisles held echoes, children laughing during festivals, choirs processing slowly in candlelight, footsteps of those who came and never returned. Every echo was a layer, a note in the song the cathedral sang silently. Forever. Even now, if you walk those aisles alone, without phone, without voice, without rush. You might feel the shift, a pressure in the air, a stillness in your bones, a presence just ahead or just behind. And if you pause, you may hear something faint, a whisper, a name, a prayer, or nothing at all. Which in cathedrals often means everything. The towers that spoke with bells. Not all voices are made of breath. Some are made of bronze, of iron, of echo. And high above the vaulted ceilings, beyond the stained glass and the whispering aisles, the cathedral held its most powerful voice, its bells. They did not simply ring. They spoke, and the towers that held them were not merely structures. They were throats of stone, lifting sound toward the heavens and casting it across cities, fields, forests. To climb a bell tower was not easy. Narrow stairs, spiraling endlessly upward, worn thin by centuries of feet. The smell of dust and cold iron. The occasional window, showing the land getting smaller as your breath grew heavier. Then, suddenly you emerged into a space not built for beauty, but for resonance. There they were, the bells, some the size of horses, others small, delicate, ancient. Each had a name, a tone, a purpose. One rang for mass, one for mourning, one for feast days, one only during plague, and some rang without schedule, as if something beyond time had pulled their rope. Bells were baptized, blessed, anointed. They were not objects. They were beings. People knelt before them. Priests spoke prayers into them. And when a new bell was hoisted into place, the entire village gathered to listen to its first sound. They called it the bell's birth cry, and it echoed through every heart that heard it. The bell ringers were guardians of time. They knew the rhythms of the day: matins, lauds, prime, terce, none, vespers, compline. Each hour a note, each note a moment of remembrance. They climbed before sunrise, rang through snow, sweated in summer heat. And they listened to the wind, to the sky, to the silence before the strike, because a bell, they said, must never interrupt the holy. The sound of a bell could be felt in the chest, in the marrow. It could summon armies, end wars, mourn kings, celebrate birth. And in times of fear, storms, fires, invasions, the bell rang not to call, but to protect. Some believe that its sound drove away evil, scattered demons, healed the sick, because when the earth trembled and the sky cracked open, people looked to the tower and waited. But towers could be lonely places. The wind never stopped. The cold was constant. And those who tended the bells often lived above the world, unseen. One legend tells of a ringer who never spoke aloud, only through bells. He rang joy with 2 short pulls, sorrow with 1 long, and when he died, They say the bells rang themselves at his funeral. No hands. Just sound, just goodbye. Over time some towers crumbled. Some bells fell, some were melted down for war, but others remain. Still suspended. Still silent until the moment they are needed. And when they do ring, the air bends. Birds pause mid-flight. Children look up. And the cathedral speaks again, not in sermon. Not in chant. But in the language of bronze, aged and awakened. Even today, when you hear a distant church bell, perhaps at noon or during a funeral, know that it is more than tradition. It is memory moving through metal, through sky, through soul. And somewhere in the quiet afterward, the tower listens back, the cloisters where the world fell away. Some places whisper, some echo, but cloisters? They breathe. You don't walk into them. You enter their stillness, as if stepping out of time. Within the great cathedrals, tucked behind thick walls, there existed hidden squares of silence, cloisters, gardens wrapped in stone, corridors built not for speed, but for presence, for walking in circles until your thoughts dissolved into stillness. They weren't made for crowds, nor spectacle. They were built for the soul. Where monks walked in quiet, where candles flickered softly in the wind, where ivy climbed the old walls with the patience of eternity. Each stone column was both a boundary and an invitation. To turn inward, to listen deeply, to let go. The garden in the center was never random. Often it followed sacred geometry, a cross formed by 4 paths, a central well or tree. Plants chosen for meaning, not just beauty. Lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance, lily for purity. And sometimes nothing at all, just moss, stone, and the hum of bees. In the cloister, footsteps softened. Words vanished. It was said that God walked there, not above, but beside, not in voice, but in breath. And those who wandered its paths were not lost. They were being led back to something they had forgotten, perhaps themselves. The monks knew its rhythm. They walked slowly, hoods drawn, hands tucked in sleeves, one foot after the other. Not to arrive, but to be. It was their sacred practice, to walk, to breathe, to release. Each step a prayer, each turn a surrender. Sometimes they wept, not in sorrow, but in relief. Because in the world outside, time demanded, but in the cloister, time rested. And the soul, which had been running for so long, finally found a place to sit. There were benches, carved from stone, smoothed by generations, and when someone sat upon them, they joined a silent lineage. The tired, the broken, the seeking, the grateful. All had sat there. All had left something behind, a question, a wound, a whisper. Birds nested in the archways. Wind brushed through the walkways, carrying leaves and petals like old letters. And if you sat long enough, you might begin to notice the world was still here, but quieter, gentler, waiting. Some cloisters were destroyed, turned into courtyards, offices, parking lots. But others remain, preserved, revered. And when you visit one, if you silence your steps and close your eyes, you may feel it, the pull inward, like the turning of a page, like the drawing of breath, like the moment before you remember something you've carried for lifetimes. The cloister does not ask for belief. It offers presence, and in that gift, many have found what they didn't know they had lost. The crypts where the dead remembered the living. To go beneath a cathedral is to enter another kind of silence. Not the silence of reverence, not the hush of cloisters, but a deep, grounded silence, thick with memory, still with truth, dense with time. This is the realm of the crypts, where the dead do not sleep, they watch. The crypts were not always meant for fear. They were not dungeons, not prisons. They were foundations, spiritual roots beneath the cathedral's rising spires. Living world above moved in color and song. But here, in the shadowed stone, Eternity waited without rush. To descend into the crypt was to descend into yourself. The air changed, cooler, denser, and the light dimmed until it became something closer to memory than vision. Stone walls lined with sarcophagi, chambers lit by flickering candles, smells of earth, dust, wax, and centuries. Every step felt like a question, and the answer? It came not in words, but in presence. Many were buried here. Bishops, martyrs, saints, sometimes nameless. Ones wrapped in cloth, placed with reverence, marked only by a symbol carved in stone. A lamb, a cross, a single rose, each one a life that mattered. Each one a soul that returned to stillness beneath the singing stones of the cathedral. The crypt was also a library, not of books, but of bones, ribs like collapsed arches, skulls like forgotten chalices, fingers once raised in blessing, now folded in final rest. Some believed the bones spoke, that monks could hear them during vigils, not with ears, but with the heart, whispers that said, "Remember what passes, remember what remains." Pilgrims came to the crypts not just to mourn, but to connect. They lit candles for the departed, kissed stones, left notes, rosaries, scraps of prayers. They spoke to the dead as if they were closer to God than anyone living, and perhaps they were, because in death there is no mask, no pretense. Only the soul, bare, bright, and returned. Legends tell of crypts that held miracles. Story speaks of a sealed tomb that glowed faintly for 3 nights after a widow knelt beside it and whispered the name of her lost child. Another tells of a monk who prayed for guidance, only to hear a single word echo through the stones: forgive. Whether true or not, the crypt carried the kind of stillness where anything felt possible, because when you touch eternity, what else is there but wonder? Some crypts have chapels, tiny altars, frescoes on walls that flake like ancient skin. Monks would hold secret services here, weddings during war, baptisms in the middle of famine. The underworld was not just for endings, it was also for beginnings. Today, many crypts are forgotten, close to the public, hidden behind locked gates, but some remain open, and those who enter them slowly, respectfully, without phone or flash, they feel it. Not fear, not sadness, but a kind of homecoming. As if the bones were saying, "We remember you." Because perhaps the dead do not wait to be remembered. Perhaps they remember us. The roofs where heaven touched the earth. The roof was the end and the beginning. Above it, only sky. Below it, the centuries that dreamed upward. To reach the cathedrals. Roof is to stand at the edge of the human and the divine. There are no pews here, no stained glass, no relics. Only stone, wind, and sky wide enough to swallow all questions. Climbing to the roof meant effort, narrow stairs, dusty ladders, doors that groaned after lifetimes of silence. But those who made the journey found something unexpected. Not a place above others, but a place closer to nothing. And in that nothing, everything. The gargoyles waited here. Stone mouths open, eyes wide, perched like sentinels. Some believe they warded off evil. Others said they carried away the rain. But one monk wrote in a journal, "The gargoyles do not guard, they grieve. They laugh for us when we forget how." Each grotesque a frozen emotion. Cast in stone. From the rooftop, you could see the town laid bare, the market square, the river winding like a ribbon, the smoke rising from chimneys where mothers called sons to dinner. From this height, the world was small, precious, fragile, and the sky, it felt not distant, but close, like something you could almost touch if you dared lift your hand. Wind ruled here. It howled in winter, whispered in spring. In autumn, it carried the scent of leaves. In summer, the taste of storm. It wrapped itself around the spires, ran fingers across the lead tiles, danced with birds and sometimes with thoughts too heavy to carry back down. Some monks would climb here not to maintain the roof, but to pray, to be alone, to cry, to breathe in the sky. They etched prayers into stone with nails, left feathers as offerings, whispered names into the wind, because up here the soul had space to stretch, and the silence. It was vast, not empty, a cathedral unto itself. When lightning struck the towers, it echoed through the bones of the building. The bells rang without hands. The stone trembled, but the roof held, because it was never just shelter. It was testament that what we build from the earth can reach the sky without losing its soul. And now, you stand here, you've wandered the nave, touched the walls, sat in the cloisters, listened to the bells. You've knelt in the crypt, followed the aisles, gazed through stained glass, and finally, you are here, above the world, beneath the sky. Within the cathedral's final secret, the wind brushes your cheek, carries a scent of incense, a note of a long-forgotten hymn, a name you haven't spoken in years, and just before you turn to descend, you hear it, not in your ears, but in your chest, a whisper as gentle as breath. You are the cathedral now.